Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
Welcome to this special edition of the ITPro Podcast, brought to you in association with RSA.
Since lockdowns came into effect, businesses across the country have been scrambling to institute remote working infrastructure to support employees. But while speed has understandably been a focus, security should not be neglected. Today, we're joined by Angel Grant, Director of Digital Risk Solutions at RSA Security, and Kevin Fielder, CISO of Just Eat, to discuss how businesses can use the current situation as an opportunity to establish a culture of safe, secure and sustainable remote working within their organisation.
Angel, Kevin, welcome to the ITPro Podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be on here.
So, obviously, the current situation has led to huge changes in how businesses are operating. Many have turned to 100% remote working for the first time. So, to kick us off, how much of an impact has this situation had on businesses from a security perspective? Angel, what do you think?
So security has been completely changed during this situation where initially people were just rampantly getting up and running and security got pushed to the back where people were more focused on sustaining operations versus security. So what we're seeing is security is now back top of mind because organizations are starting to see the vulnerabilities that have been open. So that's the biggest change I've seen in the current situation we're in.
And Kevin?
So it depends a lot on the organisation, I think. So obviously, the impact of it will vary from if you're a very flexible, lots of remote working organisation already, the impact may have been relatively low in comparison to someone at the other end who's an organisation that's very office-based, possibly with desktops, those kind of things. So it'll depend how much change you've had to make to your organisation will depend on sort of the impact of your security and your risk profile. Obviously, for all of us, there's been an uptick in social engineering and phishing and those kind of things. And I guess the big difference between this and most kind of catastrophes or issues is it's so global, so the kind of scale and blast radius of phishing campaigns and those kind of things is much wider than it would be for a lot of other sort of issues we've dealt with before. And I guess the other big impact is the length of the change. So I think a lot of people have BCP and DR plans that involve one office, if you've got multiple offices, or one country possibly closing for a short period. All of your offices globally and all of your call centres and all of your factories closing for months is something that most companies probably hadn't prepared for or planned for. So it's the length of the change, how global the change is, and obviously depending on as I said, what your organisation did and how it worked previously is probably how big it will define how big an impact it's been on any given group or organisation.
So Kevin, does remote working affect how security should be communicating with the rest of the business?
So yes and no. I think that's probably going to be the way I answer a lot of questions. So someone made a great quote recently. I was on a podcast and they said that if a catastrophe or incident has made you drastically change how you were doing security, you were probably doing it wrong in the first place. So I think if you're doing really good stuff from a culture and communication perspective, you're probably still in a good place. I think with everyone, if you're used to being in the office, so you can do things like desktops and posters and going to chat to people, you've probably had to really level up your other ways of communicating. And obviously with everyone being, the way messages get around in terms of water cooler chats and other things will have changed. So I think for us, it's just been increasing the amount of messaging and kind of focusing on what's changed. So if you're not used to working from home, it's not just make sure you use a corporate laptop, how to use the VPN, don't share your password, all of those kind of things that are normal. It's also thinking about things like kind of operational security. So if you're doing a call that's possibly discussing financials or sensitive things about the organisation, should you be doing them in your garden when your neighbours are outside playing? Those sort of things. I think there's some other concerns, especially if you have a large group that weren't used to working from home. So I guess in short, it's increase the amount of comms you do, especially kind of email, intranet, those sort of things that people will still be accessing. So really level up how you're using your kind of channels that work from home. And consider any changes to messaging where people have changed working practices. Are making sure you might not be that concerned about locking your laptop when it's in your office and you're the only one in the house, but now your kids are at home and everything else, you probably want to be doubly sure that that people can't access your laptop, neighbours can't overhear those things. So possibly some changes to messaging to consider changes in working practices.
Is that reflective of your experience as well, Angel?
Absolutely. I totally agree with what Kevin just said. And just to build off of what he was saying is the frequency of communication is an important thing to consider. The frequency, the cadence, as well as the location of the information and the way that you're pushing that information out. In a lot of cases, it does need to become more of a push model versus a pull model from a communication strategy, so that it is a constant reminder of what's new and different. And the other thing to consider is the rapid change of policies that are occurring based upon the different phases an organization's going through, and tools and technologies that's being rolled out to support this situation. Communication needs to stay in touch with that, with the new policies. So what that means is the security teams and those teams do need to better collaborate in their communication process. So as organizational risk tolerant and new applications are being rolled out and supported, those two need to be in lockstep. And also with changing operations regulatory requirements and privacy requirements, that potentially could evolve over the next year. That needs to be very carefully communicated to employees as well. And to be very effective, this is where the communication not just needs to come from the security teams. The communication also needs to come from leadership to make sure that it's clear that this is part of our corporate culture. This is important for our business sustaining future and having a viable future. Security is part of our sustained operations. So the ongoing frequency of it, how it's done, that does need to be, continuously reevaluated as organizations transition through the different stages.
So if you have a look on Twitter at the moment, you'll know that many people are only getting sort of half-dressed at best, maybe doing entire days in their pyjamas. Are they having a similarly laissez-faire attitude when it comes to working from home with security versus being in the office, Angel?
Not necessarily more lax, but different. I think it's important to remember that this working from home is not the normal working from home, where right now, many people are not necessarily using, have the right equipment. They may not be thinking about all the different new types of risks that have come with that, like potentially using a home printer or using, their own device that they had to supply. They're balancing it while trying to be a teacher, and with kids coming in asking questions, they're potentially quickly looking up things on their own work device that may potentially infect it and impact the organization. They are also not working traditional hours, which may impact some of the traditional modeling that organizations look for access controls and behavioral anomalies. And then we're going to see more of that when summer starts, with people working all kinds of different hours. The other thing that, and again, I think a lot of these are unintentional consequences, is that people are sharing a lot more on social media. So people are expressing their frustration with a lot of different things, maybe complaining about how many hours they're working or strange things they have to do while they're at home. But what they're really doing is sharing more information than they probably should about how they're working and what they're working on and projects they're working on social media, which puts them as a target for identity theft, not just in their personal life, but also allows for more targeted spear phishing attacks for that employee, potentially engaging as someone from HR talking about revisited benefits that they were just complaining about on social media that they took away from their retirement funds or something like that. So people do need to be really sensitive about that. So from a behavior perspective, I think people are using their devices more in different ways, working different hours and behaving differently, but not ill-intended. Because this is not the normal work from home that those of us who were working from home before the current situation were in.
And Kevin, sort of following on from that, how should threat models be adjusted, sort of taking into account all of these things?
So it's as with any kind of threat model, it's looking at what are the ways of attacks and what's changed in terms of how people could get in or access systems. I think the big thing, touching on what Angel was saying, is it's for either if you're not used to working from home or if you're used to working from home some of the time, the big change is working from home all of the time. So even if you have good security practices, it's probably easier for most people for those to lapse. So you just get comfortable at home. You know, the kids might be running around, or even if you live on your own or however you live, you're comfortable in your home environment. And as the days and weeks go by, we all know, you know, for me, a smart day is when I wear a top with sleeves. So yeah, I made that joke the other day that someone will comment that I'm always in a sort of a gym vest top, and I was like, if I've got sleeves on, I've probably been interviewing. So it's those kind of things where you get more relaxed at home and you're a bit more chilled and you're okay. I can work from my bed or whatever you're doing. That then you might start slipping a bit on your practices. So our threat model should consider not just the fact that everyone's at home and people might be overheard, but also that people who have good practices normally might be more likely to slip into bad or more relaxed practices. The example of leaving your laptop unlocked because people aren't usually in the house, or working from your garden, not being considered of who's overhearing, those sort of things where you just have to keep nudging people and reminding them to make that. So my threat model, I think the big change is assuming you've got secure remote access and decent 2FA and everything else to protect your systems, and you can patch and monitor laptops and stuff at home, is more going to be around the behavioural side of things and how we both do our best from a technical and process perspective to mitigate that, but also from a training and people perspective to kind of keep reminding them and work on making sure people are aware that they have to be act with the same rigour they would as if they were working normally.
So I totally agree with what Kevin just said, and to build on that, many of the threat and user behavior models need to take into consideration the changes in user behavior, access controls, locations, and heightened threats, all the things that he just mentioned. But I think the good news is there's many threat models that are self-learning models out there already that can adapt and tune for a lot of these changes. So they can naturally take and modify as they learn and tune. The difference, though, is I think looking at the threat models, many organizations' policies have changed too. And so the threat models, depending upon what you're doing with them, do need to align with the new organizational risk tolerance. The other thing to consider is, what do the threat models look like when you have that blended workforce where some people are coming back to the office, some people are remote, and there are strict conditions of returning to the office. So for example, in some areas we're seeing that there's conditions like, for example, immunity passports or participating in contact tracing, temperature checks. So what does that look like, and what are some of the risks involved with that from an insider threat that needs to be taken into consideration and honed in the threat modeling? So for example, we should anticipate an increase of identity theft, of people trying to purchase fake immunity passports so that they can go back to work, so they're no longer employed. And think about what does that look like in your threat modeling, and also think about what does that look like if you need to start blending physical, like where your employees are within the building, or remote, in proximity type of location information linked to your access controls. So those are some of the future things that I think organizations should think about when they're looking at their threat models and what needs to potentially get adjusted.
So moving on to the technology piece, this is something that has seen a substantial amount of debate over the previous weeks and months. Are endpoint devices more or less of a risk, do you think, in a working from home scenario versus when the majority of the workforce is in the office?
First of all, I have to put out there that I think the definition of what we call endpoint has continued to evolve, right? So basically a system equates to an endpoint. That's computers, phones, tablets, printers, other IoT-enabled devices that people are using depending upon their role and the type of industry they work in. And the reality is, when many people started going remote, a lot of new IT infrastructure was set up, a lot more endpoints were quickly set up, causing this kind of shadow IT type of thing, which caused a big risk to the organization. So the risk is many IT teams don't know what all those endpoints are that are accessing their resources. And what are they doing with those resources, and getting control of that. So, when what we just talked about before, people are using their devices in a way that they may not have traditionally, and quickly going onto sites and potentially infecting those devices, which are touching a lot more things than data. So we also are seeing, a lot of organizations move forward into automation. So those devices are increasingly doing things on behalf of users. So that does cause another aspect of risk that needs to be understood of, do you trust that endpoint or do you not trust that endpoint? So I think it's a renewed focus on what the definition of endpoint is and how do you trust that endpoint? The definition of how you secure it has dramatically changed. You've seen more endpoint detection and response type of tools out there that are incorporating all different types of technologies to be able to both dynamically detect threats and respond to them in real time. But I think it's important for organizations to look at their endpoints right now and determine what level of trust they are going to have and what level of risk tolerance they have for those endpoints. And that ranges from performing risk assessments and pen testings on those devices, creating a logically segmented system and network to understand how the access controls and rules apply to them. That way it helps minimize the lateral movement between them. Understand and be able to quickly discover endpoint changes and detect anomalies for that user behavior changes that we were just talking about. And then also, being able to still understand what kind of malware or malicious activity is occurring on those devices as well. So at the end of the day, I think the biggest risk is the definition of endpoint has changed and the rapid deployment of new and different endpoints during this time.
Kevin, I'm interested to hear your view on endpoint security, given that Just Eat as an organisation has been largely based around remote working and individual laptops for some time now.
So I think the answer to the question of the original question would have been, as with all these, it depends on your organisation, right? So for us, we already have the ability to manage people's endpoints wherever they are. Most of our management solutions are cloud-based services, etc. So the change to how we manage things from people working at home more wasn't hugely dramatic. Obviously, depending on how people are connecting and do we deploy things over the VPN, etc. And huge patches and updates might be a bit more challenging. But in general management terms, we didn't have too many problems with the change. I think the big change for us, and I think for all security teams, regardless of whether you're set up to manage things remotely or not, kind of almost going back to the learning threat models that Angel mentioned, is the baseline's kind of completely thrown out the window. So I think that the big change for us and for everyone around how we manage and monitor things is where before people might have had a pattern of being in the office Tuesday, Thursday and working these hours, etc. That's all out the window. So people are working funny hours because they're juggling family and homeschooling and all of those things. They're logging in from home and from other places. So the things we had as baselines and behaviour all went out the window. So I think our biggest challenge was re-understanding what the baselines look like. And I think for as security improves in this environment and changes, the big thing will be being much more granular with those baselines. So again, if you're an organisation where most people had working patterns and most teams worked the same hours, you could be fairly broad strokes with how you looked at behaviour and how teams and whole departments work for anomalies. Now, with people being much more flexible, your sort of baselines of behavioural analysis and what looks good and bad are going to be much more individual, because me as an individual may work very different hours and from different locations to the rest of my team. So I think if you're set up to patch and manage things remotely, you're in a good place, but your security team should be very aware of how much more individualised we need to make our behavioural baselines to keep them effective and useful to the organisation.
So, Angel, does remote working give attackers new entry points?
Remote working potentially does give attackers new entry points. There's a variety of different things that open this up. We talked about some of it already, like the shadow IT, the increase in endpoints, remote workers bringing their own devices and acting as their own local admins in some case, access sprawls, and the rapid adoption of new technologies and not really fully understanding what default system parameters were leveraged during that time. One of the most interesting vulnerabilities that organizations do need to remember is the human vulnerability, right? So during this time, we're seeing social engineering and phishing attacks leading to things like ransom attacks spike. Within our fraud action services, our cyber intelligence services, we've seen an incredible spike in targeted phishing attacks all across the globe. And the reason for this is people are more emotionally vulnerable during times of crisis, right? One of the things that's very important to remember is cybercrime is not necessarily a technology problem. In most cases, it's a psychology problem. And what we're seeing is cybercriminals targeting what we call this primal triggers. So I look at them as the 4 Fs. So food, fear, flight, and I'll keep it clean, fornication. So in the 4 Fs, what we're talking about, if you think about the things that have been promoted on various social media forums about, how do we get more toilet paper, or how do you get more meat, or how do you protect yourself, they're a lot more advertising that's very targeted. People are more vulnerable than ever. They're seeing a sense of urgency, and scams are increasing, playing on that sense of urgency and fear. But also people are lacking a sense of belonging. And so people are being heavily targeted on trying to find a cause or unity, and with various scams that are targeting individuals based upon what they're posting on their social media to, again, socially engineer them to either conduct identity theft in their personal life, but also target them in their professional lives as well. So that's something that I think is a very interesting vulnerability that organizations need to closely monitor and be aware of how their employees are being manipulated and targeted.
So one idea within security that keeps rearing its head is the idea of perimeter defense. But in a world of remote working, does traditional perimeter defense still hold any value at all for security teams?
I think the perimeter, in inverted commas, has been dead for a long time, hasn't it? It's much more about how you trust a given service, device, person combination to access a given system or piece of data and do things with it. And do you trust them to access it? Do you trust them to process it, etc.? So for me, it's much more moving. I hate the term zero trust, but it's that, it's trust but verify. I think zero trust should be rebranded trust but continuously verify, which is what it's doing, right? So that whole piece of how do I constantly check that I trust you and your device or your component to access these things and do the action, perform the actions you're trying to. So I think the perimeter in that sense is long gone. People work from anywhere. People work from their phone, their laptop. Most companies have stuff in IaaS, PaaS, various cloud services, Salesforce, all the other kind of SaaS services. So you've got data and systems, maybe on premise, maybe not on premise, maybe both. Spread out all over the place. You've potentially got colleagues working all over the world, sitting in cafes, sitting on trains, whatever else. And our job is to enable that security. If you want the best talent and the best people, or just to be able to work at all in COVID, you need to have that flexible way of allowing people to work from anywhere, and managing your data and systems under the basis of that people will be working from anywhere, and if you're BYOD, possibly any device. So I think the traditional perimeter's long gone. But it's kind of a flexible perimeter, if you like. So you're going to have core things like your data and your systems that you really care about, and they still are hosted somewhere, and you have controls around how people access those. So there's a perimeter, but it's much more, I guess, authentication and access based rather than traditional firewall based. So yeah, access and authentication are probably the new firewall, effectively, aren't they?
Angel, what's your view on this?
I agree. The definition of perimeter has changed, and quite frankly, is almost dead. There's still a perimeter, but it's the type of perimeter is different. With that, what we really need to understand is the trust piece. Like Kevin mentioned, there's a very important piece of that is what are you trusting, and that also ties back to like the endpoint device conversation. There's so many different things that are engaging with you. And so this is really where organizations really need to take a look at, reinventory what their new quote unquote corporate network looks like, applications, devices, people, right? And then what their new network topology should look like, to make sure that they do have the right tools in place to secure that. but also move toward that trust model where you need to understand if you're having a device do things on behalf of a user, do you trust it? Do they have the right access? And that does boil down to, I think, the simplification of the CIA triad that in the security space we always talk about: confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information, but also access. In how is those resources accessing your environment, and what does that look like, and do you trust it, and do they have the right access controls and authentication or authorization policies in place to ensure that that moves the organization in the right way to properly defend that the quote unquote new corporate perimeter that's out there.
So all of this talk of access controls and limiting permissions and all of this stuff is all well and good, but as we all know, there is often very little that security teams can do to stop a user doing what they want to do. Many will just find workarounds for these kind of controls. So how can security teams effectively put a stop to this kind of behavior of employees trying to bypass what they see as frustrating security measures?
I think the most important thing to remember is convenience is king when it comes to frustrating employees. The main reason employees bypass security measures is because it's inconvenient or not understood. So if you make it convenient to get the security they need, make the security as transparent as possible so a user doesn't have to do additional steps. That's incredibly important. Make sure the policies are communicated where they can actually get the applications they need to do their jobs and the policies that go along with it, and automate that as much as possible. So they really need to, organizations really need to think about ways to simplify, still provide that simplified yet secure choice for their end users. Look at new and different ways to do self-service to help minimize help desk costs and automate as much as possible, like password resets or access requests, and then automate things like provision and deprovisioning of users for the joiner, mover, leavers of an organization. But also importantly, there's been a lot of policy changes to align with new regulations or compliance requirements or privacy requirements, or just operational sustainability requirement. That burden shouldn't be on the end user. You need to think of ways to simplify the identity governance behind that and automate that as much as possible. So at the end of the day, make it convenient for the end users to do their job, make sure they're educated on where they can find the right information and new policies to do their job. And that will really help eliminate the amount of times you're seeing users bypass the security measures.
Kevin, as a practicing CISO, what's your view on the matter?
So Angel totally hit it on the head. It's all about convenience and understanding how people want to work. Most of the time when people go round or circumvent security controls, it's not malicious. It's the person who wants to finish something off over the weekend but hasn't got a laptop, or who has a terrible laptop that emails their home address just so they can work on a decent machine at home. Those kind of things. So predominantly people just want to get their job done. So our job is to help them do that securely, and do our best to understand that. The transparent piece that Angel also mentioned is something I'm a huge fan of. So we have the technology now to be able to look at people's device location, those kind of things, and go, okay, you're saying you're whoever, Jane, and you're on Jane's machine at Jane's house, logging in at time Jane normally logs in. We can let you log in and do most things really, really simply. You say Monzo as an example here, so you can install the app and you can do things like see your balance, and I think maybe even make payments to known payees with almost no authentication. It's only when you want to do something like add a new payee that you have to do some more auth. So use technology and our knowledge of how people behave and their devices, etc., to make that authentication as seamless and invisible as possible, so we make your life as easy as we can most of the time, and then explain to you why, when we ask for more, why we're doing it. So you're trying to do something that's quite administrative or quite sensitive, so we want to double check who you are, or you haven't asserted who you are for a while, so we're going to ask for your second factor again. Those kind of things to explain what you're doing. I think the thing I'd add on top of what Angel was talking about was the cultural side of things. So the other side is the education and awareness piece. So once you've kind of done your best to build, understand the environment and build really good and seamless and usable security controls, you also, or in parallel with doing that, do your best to get engagement from your organization and help them understand why you're doing these things. So, whether it's using real examples, those kind of things of breaches, and real examples of how criminals steal data. So some of our education we did around COVID was to share some of the actual COVID phishing scams. So rather than just say, hey, be careful, we shared some of the SMS and other email phishing scams that we found on the internet to show how realistic they could be and the kind of triggers that criminals use. So we can explain they will try and pull on your heartstrings, or they will try and make you concerned about an ill relative, or those kind of things. So the behaviors they'll do and how they'll try and trick you into doing things. So this is why we ask you to be extra cautious, but also why we sometimes ask for your password and sometimes ask you for the second factor, and make sure you reboot your machines, or understand that we will reboot your machine for you sometimes to make sure it's patched and up to date. We do this because of the criminals and us trying to protect our data. So to get people engaged with your mission and to understand that, give them real examples of what happens out there. So it's not just a kind of, here, do some awareness training. It's here, here's actual examples of criminals stealing data that they are trying to do from us. So we're doing our best to enable you to work safely, but also to make sure we're doing our job and protecting the organisation's systems and data as well.
So, Angel, are there ways that proper security can make business more effective on a day-to-day basis rather than just preventing outages, breaches and all that negative kind of stuff?
Absolutely. I think, to Kevin's point about a culture thing, in the past, security teams have always been looked at as like the no team, the barrier to success, the team that's trying to block you from things. There's many times that I've been in meetings with my customers and we'd have the security teams and the business folks, having quite a dramatic debate about what's needed to properly secure a business so it continues to sustain. But what we're seeing more is that the security team is actually being looked at as more of a business enabler team. And that's because they're changing the language and the way they're having conversations, because it is a board level conversation now of why security is important, why security can help sustain operations. So I think the most important thing right now is for the security teams to continue to do their job and secure the organization, but the way they communicate and engage with the organization, it needs to make sure it's clear that they're doing it in a way that's enabling the business to be more innovative, sustain their operations, as well as allow them to sustain compliance with many of the regs out there. And I think that's also important that organizations realize that during this time, security requirements are going to continue to change. And again, this is where the security, risk, and IT teams need to work in lockstep and unify so that they can make sure that as things adapt, they can be agile and adapt with that as well. And their security teams no longer can be looked as just an IT, like a siloed area or IT control. It needs to become a broader part of a risk strategy, so that in the future it's well thought of from a business continuity and business resiliency plan. So I think there's a lot of different ways, and it's just a cultural thing. The security teams have been doing a great job. It's just a matter of making sure they're no longer looked at as the no guys.
And Kevin, what's your take on this?
So I think security, we need to be seen as an enabler, and we need to get away from the don't do that mindset to the how can I help you mindset. So I think most of us in the field have moved in this direction sort of quite a while ago, but certainly for myself and the team, we're very passionate about how we help do things better and how we help do things faster, whether that's through things like the seamless authentication and transparently kind of securing things that we've talked about today, or whether it's things like automated security testing in the pipeline. So if if all of your devs and engineers get immediate feedback on things so we can make development faster, you can then work with them and talk through the story and of how, rather than, we all know those graphs from kind of Gartner and people around, if you find an issue like the day before go live or after it's live and you've been breached, or you have to run around doing fixes, that's hugely expensive. If we tell you 5 minutes after you check your code in, or even as you're typing your code, that could be a potential security issue, let us help you remediate it, let us suggest ways to fix it. We're seen as people that are helping do things fast and safely. So I think culturally, security has to have that mindset. I think, as we've touched on, people will go around security if you're seen as slowing it down. And that's depending where you work. If you're kind of MOD or highly regulated, you can get away with being more prescriptive because you work this way or you don't work for us. I think as you get to less regulated environments and you're trying to attract the best talent and be fast and agile and do tens, hundreds, thousands of releases a day, all of those good things, you more and more have to be that enabling function, because people will just go around you. People won't talk to you and engage with you if you slow them down, because speed and agility and delivery are the order of the day. So we absolutely have to be part of that conversation, and we absolutely have to be culturally seen as enabling us to do things fast and safely, not slowing things down. I think that's hugely critical.
So obviously the people listening to this podcast, their organisations are not the only ones who are remote working. Everybody has been thrown into this, which means that their suppliers have, and their suppliers have, and also their customers have. What impact can this have on the security of organisations, Angel?
Well, we clearly saw a major supply chain disruption through this whole situation, where it amplified the importance of the focus of understanding the vendors you're working with, your business continuity plans around that. And it also amplifies the importance of taking a step back and doing a third-party risk assessment, looking at your vendor risk assessment process, and how you can simplify that, how you can keep that ongoing, and how you can continuously engage. And it's not just understanding which vendors you're engaging with, because a lot of vendors have changed and weren't able to stay up with the supply chain. There's been a lot of vendors that potentially have gone out of business in the mix of this, so making sure that the right access controls were shut down. So you need to really revisit your third-party risk assessment. Who's accessing your resources, and are they still a viable resource to be accessing your environment? And I think that's a very important thing as we're looking at the workforce. Being part of that, being third parties, is to make sure that you do have the right access controls around that. You do understand the risks that are associated with the different vendors you're engaging with, and revisit your vendor assessments.
So in terms of moving forward from this current crisis, what would be your advice for the organisations who are looking to use this as an opportunity to build secure, sustainable remote working into the DNA of their organisations?
So I think it's a bit that journey you're going on. So a lot of organisations will have very abruptly gone from either some or limited working from home to everyone working from home. So we've kind of proven it works in lots of places. Obviously, if you need to physically be somewhere doing something, it doesn't work. But if you're in an organisation where you can work remotely, we've proved it does work, and we are proving it does work every day by working remotely. So it's looking at what's working well from that. It's learning from what people are enjoying, what people are struggling with, and reassessing it. We talked about threat models earlier, so assessing what your threat model is. So from a security standpoint, it's looking at what's working well, what are your risks, what things are you struggling with, where do we need to improve things, and not being afraid to make big changes. So if people are really frustrated with your VPN and your access, do you want to throw that all out, and obviously not until you've replaced it, but look at sort of wholesale replacements to enable it. So if you see the value of flexible working, invest in it, and invest in appropriate solutions and capabilities to enable that. Obviously along with that, there's the cultural piece. So I think ongoing awareness and education of how to do it securely, and probably just that ongoing sort of more frequent nudges of reminders, which I think is the best way to do awareness and culture anyway, rather than kind of big courses. Just keep giving people little nudges of things to remember, but obviously with the kind of change in focus to allow secure, how people do secure remote working, and like the examples earlier, how do you work securely in the garden, can people see your laptop, what are your kids doing, those sort of things on top of the previous sort of messages you may have been using. And I think the other thing is, then as you do that, if you find your office spaces are less full, can you then start redesigning your office spaces? So a lot of people may have long leases on offices, so they can't just stop having them. But so say your office is now 30-40% full rather than 100% full most days. Can you redesign your office to make it a much better space for people to be productive? So I always use the example of MIT and places from sort of late 70s and 80s where so much innovation happened, and what they had was open spaces for people to collaborate and closed office spaces for people to work quietly. And we've kind of thrown away the closed space, and we just have these open offices that are terrible for concentration, and don't really allow collaboration because you're still sitting at desks. So can we redesign offices to make them superb collaborative spaces? So when people go into the office, it's to have really successful and productive time in the office, and where they want to do face-to-face collaboration and brainstorming and whatever else, and then they can work at home whenever they want as well. And I guess the other thing culturally is getting used to working hours being different. So we also often have that thing as a leader, you shouldn't send emails on a Saturday evening because people will think they should work. We need to culturally teach people that just because I'm working on a Saturday night because maybe I want to take Monday morning off or whatever, doesn't mean you need to be. So we need to kind of get that cultural education out there, that there is never an expectation for you to be working in hours when you're not working, but equally you are allowed to work much more flexible hours on what works for you. So it might be start early, do a bunch of stuff, then spend the middle of the day with your family, then work in the evening, whatever works for you. So we need to kind of have that cultural piece that people really get the message that as long as they attend certain core meetings, they can work in a way that works for them. So for me, it's a lot about kind of general culture and office and environment as much as it is about security things.
And Angel, what would be your takeaways?
I think this is a great opportunity for organizations to use this as a compelling event to rethink the way they always did things. Just because the way they always did things doesn't mean it was the right way. And so I think this is acting as a forcing function for organizations to rethink the way that they're working. Why were they working the way they were working? Why were they securing the way they were securing? What are their organizational risk tolerance levels? And I think it's a wonderful opportunity to take a look at that and remember that it's not just a technology thing. It's a people thing too. So it is the combination of those two together and how they complement each other. And use that as an opportunity to innovate. Use that as an opportunity to look for ways to automate things so that you're using your human resources in a more productive, effective, and secure way, and automate as much of the lower end tasks as you can so that you can help move through things quickly, innovate more, but don't lose sight of the human factor in blending both the technology and people. So I do think this is a wonderful opportunity to rethink the way that businesses are working and securing their environments.
Well, with that, we'll bring this special edition of the ITPro podcast to a close. Thank you once again, Angel Grant, Director of Digital Risk Solutions at RSA Security, and Kevin Fielder, CISO of Just Eat, for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
For more information on how to make your remote working secure and sustainable, check out RSA's white paper on preparing for long-term remote working after COVID-19. You'll find a link to that in the description of this episode.
Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find podcasts to never miss an episode.
The ITPro podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.